Okay, Chapter 9, Jacksonian America. In this chapter, we're going to look at the United States, of course, from the election of Andrew Jackson in 1828 through his 2 terms as president. And what we're going to see that America is going to continue to grow and change in this eventual build-up to the Civil War. We are going to talk about the Revolution of 1828 and how Jackson styled his presidency as just like Thomas Jefferson did quarter of a century earlier, saying that his election was a new chapter in American democracy. We'll talk about the crises of Andrew Jackson and how they are going to foreshadow the building up to the Civil War. And then lastly, we'll talk about the changes that are going to happen in the Democratic Party and how in the years building up to the Civil War, there's going to be a definite shift in the priorities of the Democratic Party. But first of all, let's talk about the triumph of democracy, which we've actually already spoken about in the previous chapter. And we spoke about the market revolution, plus the territorial expansion, plus this expansion of political democracy. And the reason for that is, by the 1830s or so, that the property requirement to vote had pretty much been abolished. Remember that in the early days of the Republic, back in the colonial days, in order to vote or hold office, you had to own property in addition to being male and to being white. So you had to be a rich white dude. By the time we get to the 1830s, this idea that owning property makes you special, this idea that owning property means you have a more meaningful stake in the outcome of government, that idea is pretty much gone. And so what we see is universal white male suffrage. All you have to be is a white dude. You no longer have to be rich. You no longer have to be a property owner to vote or run for office. And so what we see is that many, many more people in the United States are able to vote. And as a result of that, many, many more people are involved in politics. It's not like today where on a good voter turnout you might have 40% of the population turn out to vote. Politics were active and lively, and many, many people were involved in them in the early 1800s. And part of that was newspapers. At the time, America had a relatively large percentage of literate people. Many people could read and write. And it seemed like each little offshoot of a political party had their own newspapers. Of course, before the advent of radio or TV or the internet, newspapers were the main source of information. And so newspapers were big, big business, and they definitely had a political slant to them, and people were engaged in politics. Again, though, you still had to be a white male. Minorities, African Americans, Native Americans, immigrants, and of course even white women could still not vote. Now, that's not to say that these groups don't have a public presence, especially like women. Women definitely have a public presence. They're very active in church matters. They're very active in social reform. For example, in the growing abolition movement, women will be some of the most important leaders. So they do have a public presence. I don't want you to think that they're all closeted behind closed doors, the idea that they're home only to take care for the children and cook for the husband. It certainly was not that to the extent that some people believe it was. Women are engaged in outside activities, just not political activities. Americans have become obsessed with equality, but again, it's only among a certain subset. Whites, and again, really only white males. Now, we don't have aristocratic ranks, we don't have anything like that. And so we become obsessed with this idea of equality, but as you can see, equality is in quotes, really only equality for white males. All right, let's talk about Jackson. Andrew Jackson, of course, is a war hero, hero of the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812, the Seminole War. So he's a veteran. That's exactly what he is. His nickname was Old Hickory because of how tough he was supposed to be. And his claim to fame, his main political philosophy was he is the champion of the common man. And really what that means is he's going to attack those that he sees as privileged in the United States. And those that he regarded as privileged were those that lived back east, specifically in New England. So when he says that he's the champion of the common man, really what he means is that he's the champion of the West. he definitely believes that the future of the United States lies out west. And so he wants to transfer the old power centers of the East further west. Now, he also claimed that he was the champion of the common man because he gave the right to vote to so many people. Now, that may or may not be true. It is true that more people were voting than ever before. That is undisputably true. More people are engaged in politics in the 1820s and 30s than at any point prior to American history. Partially because more people could vote. As you abolished the land requirement in order to vote and hold office, obviously more people are going to vote because more people could vote. More people had the opportunity to vote. But it's also partially because of party politics. Remember that the Founding Fathers were dead set against the idea of political parties, and it won't be until the 1820s and 30s that political parties become developed enough that they're able to mobilize people into voting for their candidates. And the man to thank for that is Martin Van Buren. Van Buren really is the father of the modern political party. And what Martin Van Buren believed was that ideological commitments are less important than loyalty to the party itself. And what I mean by that is, your personal beliefs did not matter if you were a Democrat, as Martin Van Buren was. He did not care what your personal beliefs were. He put party loyalty above that. So think about the Democratic Party of today. It's kind of easy to paint with broad brushstrokes, right? It's easy to say, well, all Democrats are pro-choice and all Democrats are pro-gun control and all Republicans are pro-life and all Republicans believe in gun ownership rights. It's very easy to paint in those broad brushstrokes, but does that mean that every Democrat is pro-choice? Does that mean that every Republican is pro-life? No, it doesn't. Those are the broad party platforms. But what Van Buren is saying is, if you're a Democrat, it doesn't matter if you're pro-life. If you're a Democrat, it doesn't matter what your personal beliefs are. You need to be loyal to the party and vote the way the party wants you to. And that is how political parties operate today. That's how we come to those broad brushstrokes, because even a pro-life Democrat will probably be pressured into voting for a pro-choice piece of legislation, because that's just the way that it works. So ideological commitments are less important than loyalty to the party itself. You put the party above your own personal beliefs. The second thing is, and the reason why the era of good feelings did not work out, is because a political party must have opposition. They must have a sense of purpose. They needed somebody they could be against. They were Republicans because they weren't Democrats. They were Democrats because they weren't Republicans. They had to have something to define themselves against. Well, I'm a Democrat because I don't believe in these Republican things. I'm a Republican because I don't believe in these Democrat things. That's what political parties need. They needed something to base their opposition against each other. Now, as I mentioned, Jackson as president, he claimed that he was for the common man. Really, he's for equal benefits for all white males. And again, that's toppling the power centers in the East and moving that power out west. For example, the bureaucracy. The first target of Jackson was the bureaucracy. There had been some people, by this point, the 1820s, the American Republic under the Constitution had been in power for, what, 30, 40 years? There are some people who have held the same jobs maybe for that entire time. Or there was even the beginning practice of people retiring and handing their job down to their son. And of course, that is very close to an aristocratic sort of system, right? And Jackson had no use for that. So the first thing Jackson did when he became president is he got rid of all the bureaucrats and replaced them with his own people. This is known as patronage, or the spoils system, as in, to the victor go the spoils. And that's something that's still practiced today, maybe not to the degree that happened under Andrew Jackson and other presidents, but that still happens today. He also targeted the caucus system. The way that elections used to be run, people had no say in the choosing of their candidates. What would happen was the leaders of one political party would get together and choose their candidate, and the leaders of the other political party would get together and choose their candidate. So you might have the choice between candidate A and candidate B, but you had no say-so in the choosing of those candidates. The candidates themselves were chosen by the political party leaders. So you might not want candidate A or candidate B, but you have to choose between them. He gets rid of the caucus system and begins what's known as the national convention system, where in order to choose a candidate, the political parties hold a big giant meeting that everybody goes to, and then they vote on the candidates. So it's a much more open system in which people play a greater role. He does democratize political parties to that extent. He is extending political power out to those groups of people. Now, he is a true Jeffersonian. He wanted to reduce the size of the federal government, just as Thomas Jefferson would have wanted, but he is still dedicated to the supremacy of the federal government. He does believe that the federal government is supreme to the states, which is something that Jefferson probably would not have agreed with. And this is the best example of this, is the conflict between Andrew Jackson and his first vice president, John C. Calhoun, seen here. John C. Calhoun, of course, was from South Carolina. He was one of the war hawks elected prior to the War of 1812, and he had risen through the ranks until finally he had been chosen as Andrew Jackson's vice president. And that's going to lead us into the first crisis of Andrew Jackson. So there are three crises that Jackson has to deal with under his presidency. The first one is known as the Nullification Crisis. And this is what was happening. John C. Calhoun was from South Carolina. South Carolina had a very large problem with what was known as the Tariff of Abominations. What was happening was that a tariff is a tax on imported goods. And what was happening was the farmers of South Carolina are paying more for stuff that they don't make. A tariff is designed to protect American manufacturing. So they're paying more for American-made goods, and they're selling less of their crops because if we're buying fewer goods from the British have fewer dollars to buy our southern cotton with. So they're paying more for goods and they're selling less of their own crops. They felt they were getting no benefit from this tariff of abominations. And in fact, it gets so bad that there is talk of secession. Even in the 1820s, 20 years, 30 years before the outbreak of the Civil War, there's already talk of secession in South Carolina leaving the Union. Now, John C. Calhoun is from South Carolina. His home state is talking about leaving the Union. Obviously, this looks really bad. And so as vice president, he felt that he had to come up with some alternative to secession. And he comes up with what he calls the theory of nullification. Now, he builds the theory of nullification on the 10th Amendment and the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions that we spoke about earlier. And what the theory says is that the federal government is a creation of the states and therefore gets all of its powers from the states. Therefore, if the states want to declare a federal law, such as the Tariff of Abominations, if they want to declare a federal law null and void, they can do so. Well, that sounded great to South Carolina, not so much to Andrew Jackson. Jackson refused to agree that a state could nullify a federal law, and in fact, he sent troops. He sent federal troops into the state of South Carolina to enforce this federal law. And it looked like we were headed for war. Now, once again, the great compromiser, Henry Clay, stepped in and brokered a solution. But obviously, this issue of states' rights, who has more power, the state government or the federal government, this issue is already being raised even as early as the 1820s, and that is going to be a major contributor to the coming of the Civil War. The next major crisis is the Indian question. We already know that Andrew Jackson is not a fan of Native Americans. Remember that he is responsible for the Seminole War in Florida. Now, technically, only the federal government can deal with Native Americans because they're regarded as a foreign nation. They're regarded as a foreign people living on American soil. So it's just like the federal government is the only the federal government can deal with foreign countries. Only the federal government can deal with foreign people, such as the Native Americans. States can't do that. Well, what was happening was the states were doing what they wanted to, and Jackson allowed them to do this. He turned a blind eye to the state actions in removing these Native Americans from their lands. And the major reason most white people felt the Indians didn't have ownership of the land was because they weren't civilized. That is, they didn't live like white people. And there are 5 tribes in the United States, the Cherokee, the Creek, the Seminole, the Chickasaw, and the Choctaw, that were regarded as the 5 civilized tribes that presented a challenge because they did live like white people. They had permanent towns, some of them had written languages. The Cherokee even had their own constitution. And so it was very difficult to say that these Native Americans don't deserve their land because they aren't civilized, because obviously they were. And in fact, in order to keep their land, the Cherokee government, or the Cherokee people, sued the American government, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. It doesn't get much more civilized than that, right? Well, regardless of any victory they might have won, and they did win a partial victory in the Supreme Court, regardless of that, Andrew Jackson still signed the Indian Removal Act, which resulted in what is popularly known as the Trail of Tears, in which these Native American tribes were uprooted from their eastern lands and forced across the Mississippi into the Indian Territory, which of course today is mainly Oklahoma. Okay. And the third crisis of Andrew Jackson is the Bank War. Now, while Jackson might have believed in the supremacy of the federal government, he hated the second bank of the United States and wanted to get rid of it. He did not believe that the federal government had any business being in the banking industry. So one of the things that he campaigned on was he was going to get rid of the second bank of the U.S., which, remember, was already fairly controversial. Now, this is going to put him at odds with a man named Nicholas Biddle. Nicholas Biddle was the president of the Bank of the United States. Well, what happens is Biddle becomes friend with some of Jackson's political opponents, Daniel Webster and Henry Clay. He begins friendships with them, and they decide that they're going to take up the cause of the bank, and they're going to fight to save the Bank of the U.S. What Webster and Clay do, they decide that they convince Biddle to bring up the bank question during an election year, and they frame it this way. They basically say, people who want to keep the bank will vote against Andrew Jackson. That's the way they phrase it. That was their plan. They thought the bank was popular enough that enough people wanted to keep it. They were going to frame the question, if you want to keep the bank, vote against Jackson. If you want to get rid of the bank, vote for Jackson. That's how they phrased it. And in the election of 1832, Jackson won walking away. He won very, very easily. And what that showed is that most people either didn't care about the bank or they didn't have enough faith in the bank that they were willing to keep it. And so here's Jackson. He's been voted back into office on the strength of getting rid of the bank. And he wants to destroy this bank as soon as possible. And so he begins removing the government money from the bank and placing them in the banks of his choosing. These banks were known as his pet banks because they were usually owned by his political supporters and his friends. And before you know it, the Bank of the U.S. is gone, and what it leaves behind is a very unstable financial system for the United States. And we're going to see that this may not have been the wisest course of action of Andrew Jackson. As you can probably tell, not everyone loves Jackson. Jackson was a very my way or the highway kind of leader. And as time goes on, more and more people are going to chafe under his rule. More and more people are going to become vocal about their dislike of Andrew Jackson. And in fact, there's enough people who dislike Andrew Jackson that they're going to form their own political party. And this political party will be known as the Whigs. The Whig Party is a traditional English party devoted to limiting the power of the king. And that's exactly what Jackson's enemies were saying. Jackson's enemies saw him as too powerful. They mockingly referred to him as King Andrew I. And what this has done, this has created the second party system in the United States. The first party system were the Federalists and the Republicans. Well, now the Federalists are gone. The Republicans are now known as the Democrats. And we have this new political party known as the Whigs. So that's the second party system of the United States, the Democrats and the Whigs. what happens is the Whigs learn from the Democrats and they become very, very organized. That leads us up to the election of 1836. Andrew Jackson serves his 2 terms. He decides to step down, and his new vice president, the man that had replaced John C. Calhoun, Martin Van Buren, is going to run against the Whig Party. Now, the Whigs had tried to split the election and get it thrown back to the House of Representatives, just like they did in the election of 1824, the corrupt bargain, but Martin Van Buren won enough votes that he would become the next president. So they tried to split the vote and they were not successful. Now, Martin Van Buren is going to inherit a lot of problems from Andrew Jackson. What had happened was the government is out of debt. Think about that for a second. The government is completely out of debt and, in fact, is running a surplus. And they decide to return this extra money to the states. Now, the problem with this was an order known as the specie circular. Specie is precious metal like gold or silver. The specie circular was an order from Jackson that the government will only accept money backed by gold or silver as payment for debts. And what happens is this limits, since there's only so much gold and silver, this limits the amount of money that can be taken in by the government. So even though the books are showing that the government has all this money, in reality, they don't have the precious metal to back it up. And so as these pet banks are asked to pay out the surplus, they're unable to do so. They don't have enough precious metal on hand to pay out this surplus, and they have to call in loans. And as we learned a few chapters ago, once banks start to call in loans, it starts an economic panic. It starts an economic depression. And unfortunately, Van Buren didn't really have a whole lot to do with this. He just inherits this bad situation. The Panic of 1837 was the worst economic panic in American history to that point. And so as we move into the election of 1840, Martin Van Buren is going to face an uphill battle. The Whigs are going to run their candidate, William Henry Harrison, you remember the former governor of the Indian Territory, against Martin Van Buren. And the Whigs are actually going to beat the Democrats at their own game. Both parties appeal to the common man image that Andrew Jackson began, and the Whigs were simply better at it than the Democrats were. And so the Whigs are going to win, both because of the economic depression and because of their superior political tactics. So let's talk about William Henry Harrison as president. Well, unfortunately, there's not a whole lot to say. He dies almost immediately. He is the shortest administration in American history, less than a month, I believe. He contracts pneumonia and dies. He dies almost immediately, and so his vice president, John Tyler, is going to become president. Now here's the problem. John Tyler is a Whig, but really in name only. The only reason that he's a member of the Whig Party is because he thought it would bring him greater political success. He doesn't really care about the Whig platform and the issues that the Whigs care about. And so he's not willing to toe the party line. And eventually what's going to happen is he's going to break with the Whigs. And he's going to, what's the word I'm looking for? He's going to switch over to become a Democrat. So we had a sitting, think about that for a second. What if President Obama just up and decided he wanted to become a Republican? That would create a crisis. Well, Tyler is going to break with the Whig Party, and he's going to create a new alignment. He's going to create a new definition of Democrats. And so what we see happen is the Democratic Party is no longer just the party of the small farmer, which is what it had been really since the days of Jefferson. But now Southern plantation owners, these very powerful and rich Southern political entities are going to become Democrats. And that's going to create a shift with the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is going to be much more invested in the idea of slavery after John Tyler sort of breaks ranks and becomes a Democrat. So that is going to be another thing that's going to help fracture the party and lead to the breakdown of the American political system as we get closer to the American Civil War. That is the